On the morning, two men from a bank came to take everything his father had built. The boy who answered the gate was 18 years old, barefoot in the mud, and holding a letter he hadn't finished reading. They were there to begin foreclosure proceedings. They were there to assess, catalog, and eventually liquidate 112 acres of hill farm that had been in the Vance family for 3 generations. What they found when they walked through that gate was not what they expected. It was not what anyone expected. If you've ever stood at the edge of losing something that was never supposed to be yours to lose, something someone else worked their whole life to hand you, hit that subscribe button. This one is for you. The day my father was buried, the sky was the color of iron, and it rained from morning until long after dark. I remember the sound of it on the roof of the house that night more than I remember anything said at the service. The minister had known my father for 30 years, and the words he used were kind and accurate, and I heard almost none of them because I was watching the mud at the edge of the grave and thinking that the farm still needed to be checked. The cattle still needed water. The fence on the East Ridge had been down since October, and my father had kept saying he would get to it before the ground froze hard. He hadn't gotten to it. His name was David Vance. He died on a Tuesday in November, 2 weeks after his 53rd birthday, from a heart that had been wearing out quietly for years, while the rest of him kept working as though nothing was wrong. He was not a man who complained about his body. He was not a man who complained about much of anything. He got up before light and worked until dark, and sat in his chair after supper and read for an hour before he slept. And that was the architecture of a life I had grown up inside and taken entirely for granted. I was 18. I had been working the farm beside him since I was old enough to follow him down a fence line. I had no mother. She had died when I was 4, of something I was too young to understand and too old to ask about later. It had been just the two of us for 14 years on 112 acres of hill pasture and mixed timber, with a herd of 43 beef cattle and a farmhouse that needed paint, and a barn that needed a new south wall, and a gate at the end of the gravel drive that my father had hung himself from salvaged steel pipe when I was 9 years old. 2 days after the funeral, I was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I had let go cold when I heard tires on the gravel. 2 men got out of a car I did not recognize. They were dressed for an office, not a farm, shoes that were already wrong for the mud, coats without enough insulation for November in these hills. One carried a clipboard. The other carried a camera. They walked to the gate and stopped. I went out without a jacket. The cold hit me across the face like an open hand. The one with the clipboard introduced himself as a representative of Coldwater Savings and Loan. He used the word condolences once, briefly, the way people use words they have been trained to use without meaning them. Then he explained that the farm carried a loan balance of $68,000, that the final 3 payments had been missed, and that the bank was initiating a process that would, he was careful here, measured, result in the transfer of the property if arrangements could not be made within 30 days. The one with the camera had already started shooting photographs of the gate. I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Documenting the property for assessment purposes." I stood in the cold mud in my bare feet and looked at them. There was something moving in my chest that I did not yet have a name for. Not grief. I had been swimming in grief for 2 days and I knew its texture. This was harder than grief. More angular. "You need to wait," I said. "There is a letter. My father left a letter with a lawyer in town. I haven't finished reading it yet." The man with the clipboard looked at me with an expression that was trying to be sympathetic and was actually just impatient. "I understand this is a difficult time," he said. "But the bank's timeline—" "Wait," I said again. I went inside. I picked up the letter from the kitchen table. I had been reading it in sections since the morning after the funeral, putting it down each time it became too much, picking it up again. I found the section I needed and read it twice standing at the table in my cold feet on the cold linoleum. Then I put the letter back in its envelope and went to the telephone and called the number printed at the bottom of the last page. I had no idea what was on the other side of that call was about to change everything. The lawyer's name was Mr. Arthur Abernathy. He had a second-floor office on Calder Street in town that smelled of old paper and furniture polish, and he had represented my father in a quiet, ongoing capacity for 11 years without my ever knowing it. He was a small man with thin white hair combed carefully to one side and glasses he looked at people over the top of rather than through. His voice was like gravel stirred slowly with a spoon. He did not offer condolences beyond a single nod. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of me, and sat down and opened a folder. "Your father came to me 11 years ago," he said, "when the loan was first taken out. He had concerns about the original terms, which I shared. We spent 2 years in correspondence with Coldwater over what I believed was a usurious rate adjustment clause in the fine print of the agreement. The bank's position was that the clause was standard. Ours was that it was not, and that it had materially altered the repayment structure in a way that was not disclosed at signing." He turned the folder so I could see it. 11 years of correspondence, organized in chronological order, each letter dated and initialed. "Your father never stopped fighting this," he said. "He could not afford litigation. But he documented everything. Every communication, every payment made, every statement received, every discrepancy between what he was told he owed and what the bank claimed he owed." He looked at me over his glasses. "The 3 missed payments," he said, "represent an amount that is, by my calculation, less than the amount the bank has overcharged him across 16 years of rate adjustments that were never legally disclosed." I looked at the folder on his desk. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, "that if the bank proceeds with foreclosure, they will be doing so in a manner that will be difficult to defend in front of a judge." He paused. "But that is only part of what your father wanted you to know." He closed the folder and opened a second one. This one held a single sheet of paper and a smaller envelope, sealed with wax with my name on it in my father's handwriting. "He asked me to give you this when the time came," Mr. Abernathy said. "He hoped the time would not come for many years yet." He set the envelope on the desk between us. "I'll leave you for a moment. It was the most frightening thing I had ever done, and the thing I most needed to do." I opened the envelope. It began, Eli. "If you are reading this in Mr. Abernathy's office, it means I did not get to finish what I started. I am sorry for that. There is a great deal I am sorry for, and not enough time on any given day to say all of it properly, so I will say the most important thing first. I am proud of you. I have been proud of you since you were old enough to follow me down a fence line without complaining about the cold. You have your mother's patience and her eye for what matters. You will need both." I set the letter down. I looked at the wall of Mr. Abernathy's office. I picked it up again. "The farm is yours, but there is something about the farm that even you do not know, and I should have told you before now. I kept waiting for the right time. There was never a right time. So I am telling you now, this way, which is the worst way, and I am sorry for it. When my grandfather purchased this land in 1931, he paid $11 for it at a county tax sale. Nobody wanted it. The hill pasture was considered poor grazing, and the timber was second-growth scrub, and the creek that crosses the lower 40 ran dry every August. He bought it because it was cheap, and because he had nowhere else to go. What he did not know, and what I did not know until 7 years ago, is that when the county surveyed the property boundaries in 1963, They made an error. The survey placed the eastern boundary of our land 240 feet west of where it actually sits, according to the original 1931 deed. This error was never corrected in the county records. It has stood for 60 years. 240 feet may not sound like much. But that strip of land runs the full length of the eastern boundary, 3/4 of a mile. And at the north end of that strip, there is a natural spring that has never gone dry. Not in the drought of 1988. Not in the dry summer of 2002. It runs year-round, cold and clean, at a rate that a hydrologist I hired, quietly, without telling anyone, estimated at 40 gallons per minute. The spring is on our land, not on the county's land, not on the neighbor's land, ours, and 40 gallons per minute on a documented survey correction in a county that has been discussing a municipal water access expansion for the last 6 years, is worth considerably more than $68,000. The hydrologist's report is in a tin box in the barn, behind the loose stone in the third bay from the left. The surveyor's comparison documents are with it. Mr. Abernathy has copies of both. Do not let anyone tell you the spring does not belong to you. It does. I have the paperwork to prove it. His final line was underlined twice. The gate is the beginning. Everything valuable on this land starts there and goes east. I love you, Eli. I always did. Hold the line, Dad. I sat in Mr. Abernathy's office for a long time. When he came back in, he looked at my face and poured more coffee without asking. You knew, I said. I knew about the survey correction and the spring, he said. Your father was characteristically thorough. He sat down. I did not open his private letter, but I prepared for the possibility that you would need to act quickly. The bank, I said, has 30 days to proceed or negotiate, he said. We have rather more leverage than they realize. He looked at me over his glasses. The question is how you want to use it. The walk back from Mr. Abernathy's office to the farm was 3 miles. I walked it. I needed the cold and the time. The farm looked the same as it always had, and nothing like it ever had before. The gate was latched the way I had left it. The gravel drive ran up between the bare November trees the way it always had. The barn at the top of the rise looked the same as it had when I was 9 years old, and my father was hanging that gate from pipe he'd salvaged from a demolished bridge abutment, cursing quietly at the angle, getting it right. I went to the barn first. The smell hit me when I pushed the door. Hay and pipe tobacco, the ghost of it, still in the wood after all these years. And underneath that, the cold iron smell of the stanchions and the old leather of the harness on the far wall. I stood still for a moment and just breathed it. Third bay from the left. The loose stone was the one I had always wondered about, a piece of foundation limestone, slightly proud of the wall, that had never quite matched the mortar around it. My father had told me once it was a bad repair job by the man who built the barn. I had believed him. I pulled it out. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with tape, was a tin box the size of a hardcover book. My hands were not steady when I opened it. The hydrologist's report was 22 pages, typed, with a hand-drawn diagram of the spring location and a topographic sketch of the watershed. I read it standing in the cold of the barn with the smell of hay and iron and old leather around me. The spring yield numbers, the water table analysis, the comparative drought resistance profile, not once had it dropped below 30 gallons per minute. Through the drought of 1988, through the dry summer of 2002, through every test the hydrologist had applied to it, and at the end, a single paragraph in dry professional language noting that the source quality and volume were consistent with municipal supply grade water, and that the right-of-way access from the county road made it, in his estimation, of significant potential value to any public water authority operating in the region. I set the report back in the box and sat down on a hay bale and pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes. A strange sound came out of me. Not quite a laugh, not quite anything I had a name for. It echoed off the cold wall of the barn and died. Then something else came. A long, slow breath that turned into something harder before it finished. And I sat on the hay bale in my father's barn in the cold and let it happen. The cattle shifted in the lower stalls. The wind pushed at the gap in the south wall that I had been meaning to fix since October. My father had found this 7 years ago and said nothing. Had carried it quietly, paid what he could on the loan, kept documenting, kept waiting for the right time to act. I thought about all the mornings he had come down before light, moving through the cold without complaint, doing the work in front of him. He had known all along that the ground beneath him was worth more than anyone was ever going to admit. He had just needed time. Time that he ran out of. I was not going to run out of time. The next 3 weeks were the hardest work I had ever done, and I had grown up on a working farm. George at the hardware store in Millhaven had known my father for 20 years and let me run a tab without a word. Just nodded and wrote my name in his ledger. A retired surveyor named Ed, who attended the same church as my father, showed up at the farm one morning without explanation and spent 2 full days walking the eastern boundary with me, confirming by eye and by instrument what the documents already showed. He charged me nothing. When I asked him why, he leaned on his measuring rod and looked at the hill for a moment and said, "Your father helped me move a load of stone one summer. About 4 tons. I've been looking for a way to settle it ever since. I'm still not even." I spent 4 evenings at the county library reading about water rights and municipal supply agreements and easement law. I read about how public utilities acquire access to private water sources. I read about mineral rights and surface rights and the difference between ownership and use. A woman at the reference desk named Dorothy started leaving relevant texts on my Carol before I arrived each morning. The County Water Authority had a public meeting scheduled for the following Thursday. I attended. I sat in the back and listened for 2 hours while 3 commissioners discussed the limitations of the current municipal supply and the projected shortfall for the next decade, and the difficulty of finding a viable supplemental source within reasonable distance of the existing infrastructure. When the public comment period opened, I stood up and said I had a documented natural spring on private land in the eastern hills that met municipal supply specifications, and that I was open to discussing access arrangements with the appropriate parties. The room got quiet in a particular way. The second cold water letter arrived the same week, marked urgent, the language shifting from measured to pointed. They were accelerating the timeline. They were now threatening to proceed within 15 days rather than 30. A brief note at the bottom, unsigned, mentioned that they were aware the property might be subject to certain legal questions, and that it would be in everyone's best interest to resolve the matter promptly and quietly. I took that letter to Mr. Abernathy. He read it carefully. Then he set it on his desk and looked at me over his glasses with an expression that in a different man might have been satisfaction. "They know," he said. "They know about the spring. They know about the survey correction. I suspect they have been aware of it for some time." He paused. "It may explain why they were so eager to accelerate the foreclosure process. A bank holding a foreclosed property with an undisclosed water source on it is in a considerably different position than a bank holding a performing agricultural loan." He folded his hands. "They wanted the farm, Eli, not the debt repayment. I walked into the bank's main office on a Friday morning, not knowing it would be the most important meeting of my life. There were 3 of them this time. The 2 who had come to the gate, and a third man in a suit that cost more than a month of my father's loan payments, who introduced himself as regional counsel for Coldwater Savings and Loan. He had a plastic smile that he wore like a uniform and a voice that was careful and measured and designed to make you feel that what was happening to you was reasonable and fair, and probably your own fault. They talked about the loan terms. They talked about the difficulty of agricultural lending in the current environment. They talked about their commitment to working with families in hardship. They slid a document across the table, a deed in lieu agreement, transferring the property to the bank in exchange for forgiveness of the outstanding debt. $68,000 forgiven, clean exit. No further obligation. I thought about my father coming down to the barn before light for 30 years. I thought about the tin box behind the loose stone. I thought about a spring running cold and clean at 40 gallons per minute through every drought in living memory, on land that was ours. I thought about 2 men in office shoes standing in our mud, photographing our gate. I said no. The regional counsel's plastic smile adjusted slightly. Mr. Vance, I want to be sure you understand the full scope of. I understand the full scope, I said. I'd like to tell you what I understand. I put Mr. Abernathy's folder on the table, the 11 years of correspondence documenting the rate adjustment discrepancies, the hydrologist's report, the surveyor's boundary comparison, the original 1931 deed and the 1963 survey error side by side, with the 240 feet marked clearly in red ink. The bank has overcharged this farm by my lawyer's calculation more than the outstanding balance through undisclosed rate adjustments, I said. That's the loan question. Separately, the eastern boundary of this property, correctly surveyed, encompasses a spring yielding 40 gallons per minute of municipal-grade water. The County Water Authority is currently seeking supplemental supply sources. I have a meeting with them next week. I let that settle. I am not here to negotiate the deed in lieu. I am here to negotiate a settlement of the rate adjustment claim and a correction of the loan balance to reflect actual disclosed terms. Mr. Abernathy has prepared those figures. Once the balance reflects what was actually owed under the original disclosed terms, I expect the 3 missed payments will be found to be not missed at all. In fact, I expect the loan to show a modest overpayment. The regional counsel had stopped writing. The man with the clipboard was looking at the table. If the bank would prefer to contest this in court, I said, I will make the hydrologist's report and the survey comparison available to the County Water Authority, the State Banking Commission, and the local paper before we file. If the bank would prefer to resolve it here, Mr. Abernathy is available this afternoon. I stood up. I'll see myself out, I said. The resolution took 49 days. Coldwater's lawyers spent the first 3 weeks trying to find a flaw in the survey comparison. There was none. Ed's work was meticulous. They spent another 2 weeks questioning the hydrologist's methodology. The hydrologist, when contacted, stood by every number in his report with the unmoved certainty of someone who has been careful for 40 years and knows it. On the 49th day, I sat in Mr. Abernathy's office and signed a settlement agreement. The loan balance was recalculated under the original disclosed terms. The adjustment reduced the outstanding amount to $11,400, which was then offset against the documented overcharges. The bank wrote a check. It was not a large check, but it cleared. The Water Authority agreement took longer, nearly a year of survey work and environmental review and easement negotiation. But it came. A permanent easement on the spring access with annual payments to the farm that covered more than twice the original loan payment, in perpetuity, with the conservation conditions I insisted on, no development within 300 feet of the spring, no alteration of the watershed, and a public notice requirement before any change to the access terms. My father had never lived to see it, but he had built every piece of it. The day I walked back to the farm after the final papers were signed, I stopped at the gate. My father's gate, the one he had hung from salvaged steel pipe when I was 9 years old, that 2 men in office shoes had stood outside and photographed like it was already theirs. I opened it and walked through. Inside, I went to the barn, to the third bay from the left. The tin box was still there behind the loose stone. I put the settlement papers in with the hydrologist's report and the surveyor's comparison and my father's original letter, and I sealed it again and put it back. I took the worn paperback that had been in my jacket pocket since the day of the funeral, a novel I had read so many times the spine had cracked and I'd mended it with electrical tape, that it sat in my jacket like ballast through all of it, and I set it on the sill of the barn window in the last of the afternoon light. Then I flipped the switch on the barn's new light, the line I'd finally gotten properly grounded with Ed's help, and stood in the warm glow of it and listened to the cattle moving in the lower pasture and the sound of the wind on the hill. It wasn't just a farm. It was proof. I stand at that gate sometimes now, in the early mornings before the light fully comes, and look east toward the spring I've still never seen in summer drought. The water runs. The cattle are fat. The south wall of the barn got rebuilt last April with timber from our own ridge, and the east fence has been right since December. And there is smoke from the chimney and coffee on the stove, and the work of a day in front of me that is mine to do. My father did not get to finish what he started, but he finished enough of it that I could find the rest. That is the thing I come back to, standing at the gate in the cold. He did not abandon me to the difficulty. He walked ahead of me through it and left markers so I would not get lost. The most valuable things are often hidden under layers of rust and old paper and 60 years of uncorrected survey records. Not because someone was careless, because the people who came before us were careful in ways they never got to explain. If you've ever stood at the edge of losing something that someone else worked their whole life to hand you, you know what it means to find out it was never as close to gone as it seemed. What is the gate in your life? The thing that looks like an ending, that someone is trying to walk through before you've had a chance to read the letter? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for listening.